So this is a really brief presentation on structuring your assignments. It's particularly for students who are studying the core courses in the USQ Masters of Project Management program. So the presentation really is how to structure your assignments in the form of a critical analysis. Before starting the assignment, it's important to get the mindset right, because our assignments are designed to teach you to diagnose problems in projects. So imagine that the project is wheeled before you on a trolley, and what you're about to do is have a look at what some of the symptoms are. What are some of the issues? You describe what you see, and then you compare that with what the literature recommends. You see, that's the critical analysis, the comparison of what's happening with what is recommended to be best practice or common practice, or perhaps how things should be done. And then you make some sort of diagnosis. You're highlighting what the issues are. Of course, finally you come up with some sort of prescription, that is, recommendations. And that's the mindset you need in order to approach these assignments. So now I've introduced this medical analogy. Let's have a look at the three scenarios, possible scenarios you could be facing in examining your projects, because the project you're examining could be yet to commence. In that sense, what you're practicing here is preventative medicine. You're looking at documentation of how the project is planned to unfold. That's what you're examining. It could be that the project is underway, so now what you're doing is ER treatment, emergency room treatment, or the project could be completed. It could be dead, I suppose, if the management was that bad. But what we're doing now is an autopsy, and we're going back over to try and pull out some lessons learned for next time. So here's an overview of the document that you're about to produce, starting with the executive summary, introductions, and then right the way through to the references and appendix at the end. I'm going to start this presentation in the same way I suggest you start these assignments, and that is with the main body first. So dealing with the main body first, then let's have a look at an assignment, a section of an assignment. This is a section from MGT 8024. 3.1, it says discuss the risk analysis associated with this project. So the patient comes before us and we have a look to see how was risk analysis done during this project. And then after we've described that briefly, we compare that with what the literature recommends. So we'll have a look through the literature to find a similar type of project and see how it's recommended that risk analysis is dealt with. We make a comparison. There's my critical analysis. I'll make some judgments about what some of the issues were, perhaps, and then I'll come up with some recommendations, and then I'm finished. So this is what a main body section might look like. 3.1, risk analysis. So I'll start off my first little section with what is this topic all about? And I'll use a citation. Point the reader to some sort of source of authority about this. This source of authority, as well as everything else from the literature that you're going to cite, is really going to be the framework for the analysis. Then my next paragraph could be a little bit about how was risk analysis actually managed, how was it dealt with in this particular project. So I'm observing the patient, if you like, looking for the symptoms, seeing how they're behaving. Then next I'll start to draw in the literature and sort of say, well, look, actually the literature says what we should have done, how this project should be, how risk analysis should have been managed in this type of project is like this. And this is where you get to draw on the journals or the reference textbooks, and you might want to use a table or a figure to compare what was done on the project with what the literature recommends. Coming to the close of this little section, I might try and round up what I've just said now, summarize if you like. Having said all that, here are some of the issues. Don't be too detailed here, because this is really what your conclusions is going to be about. And then another short little pointer, if you like. So having said all that, that's what the issues are. Now these are some of the recommendations, or this is a way that you could possibly fix it. Going on to the conclusions, it's worth making a few comments about the tables and figures. What we don't want to see is we don't want to see lots of time cost quality triangles and figures cut and paste out of the books like Pinbot Guide. What we do want to see is that you're using tables and figures to be an integral part of the critical analysis. The analysis is actually conducted inside the table and inside the figure. So here's a table. Now I've made up the contents of this table, but in the table what I'm doing is conducting a critical analysis. I'm comparing Kirsner with Cleland and with what was done on project ABC. Now this gives me an opportunity to talk about the similarities, but also to talk about the gaps, the differences. So in this figure I'm conducting a comparison. It's a figure that I would use in something like MGT 8025, where I'm comparing different net present values with different discount rates. So I got alternative 1, alternative 2 and alternative 3, and in my discussion beneath the figure I can now talk about and reason why I'm picking one alternative over the other, and it's clear to the reader why. In this figure I've drawn on one of the classic life cycle diagrams, that's the blue part, and I would reference where that's from, but instead of just giving that image out of a book, what I'm doing on the top part in the sort of light color is now superimposing our project ABC on top of this and saying, well, this is how our life cycle, this is how the project tied into this particular life cycle. So you can see I'm using the life cycle diagram from the textbooks as a lens or as a framework to view the project under analysis. So the main body then comprises a whole pile of these sections. So I'd have section 3.1, section 3.2 and so on. Each of those with a brief little overview of the topic, brief description of what happened, brief description about what should have been done or what the literature recommends, and that in my PowerPoint slide here in the blue comprises the main body of the report. Now the conclusions. The conclusions really are almost done for you now. All you need to do is sort of just expand on them a little in the conclusion sections. So you want to be sort of teasing out each of your concluding remarks, your summarizing remarks on what the issues were from each of the sections, and draw them all together under the conclusions. Staying with my medical analogy, your conclusions are the diagnosis. They are the statement of what the problems are. The recommendations are in the same sort of format really. So again, you foreshadowed them. It shouldn't be really, when the reader gets to the conclusions and the recommendations, none of what's in the conclusions and recommendations should be a surprise. There's more detail here because of course the recommendations now expand further on what you've foreshadowed in each of the sections, but none of what the reader reads here should be a surprise. So again, drawing on my medical analogy, your recommendations might read with advice such as you should immediately do, or in the long term you might, or as preventative action you might implement, and so on. So only when you've done the main body, the conclusions and the recommendations, do you then move on to the background of the project. So this is a point where you're highlighting to the reader what are the main driving forces for the project. What is the purpose of the being for the project? Why did it come about? You've got a bit of information about the company that the project happens within, or the companies that are involved in driving the project, but what is the purpose of the project? Why is it happening? The introduction. Now, the introduction, you need to make the assumption that the reader hasn't really read the executive summary, because the document really starts with the introduction. It's introducing the reader to the analysis of the project, briefly outlines the setting in which the project takes place, guides the reader through the analysis. How was this analysis done? You might want to, and I suggest you would, point the reader to the sort of sources you've used in the analysis. So what sort of journals have you used, or what sort of textbooks have you used, and so on. It also foreshadows the findings of the analysis and the recommendations that are made, but not too detailed here. All that will come later on in the document. So this is really introducing the reader to the analysis process that you've gone through. Next, the table of contents. It may sound obvious, but there are a couple of things that you need to know. So let's take a look at a typical table of contents. We've got the executive summary, the introduction, background, and then the various parts, the main body of the report, the assignment, then the references, then the appendices towards the end. But you notice the introduction and project background begins on page 1. Everything that precedes that is given a Roman numeral. Okay, so Roman numerals for executive summary and anything that precedes that, then introduction and project background starts on page 1 right the way through to the end of the document. Here's another quick example of lists of figures. Okay, so the figures are listed out, tables are listed out, and if you look in Microsoft Office, Word, you'll find that there are automated functions to be able to produce these lists of figures, tables, and lists of contents, and I would recommend that you use them. Far easier than using lots of tab spaces. The executive summary, probably most make the mistake with the executive summary. The executive summary really tells the reader about the document they are about to read. It's different to the introduction because that really explains how the analysis was conducted. Okay, so this is about the document that the reader is going to read. It gives a summary of the project. It summarizes why the analysis was done, why it was prepared, what the analysis covers, and a summation of the conclusions and the recommendations. The reference section next. It's really important that you get the reference section right. Here's an example of a reference section. So this is the Harvard style, where we've got the author and date set out in this sort of way, and the section is listed alphabetically. If you want to know more about this, you need to visit the USQ library website, and that details in great detail how to set out your referencing. Most importantly, I suggest that you use EndNote. It's a bit of software which you can download from the library website, and it makes referencing in this sort of style incredibly easy. So lastly, the appendices. I don't have too much to say about these, other than this is a place within the document where you can put other information here which is relevant to the report, to the assignment, but that it wasn't really necessary to quote the whole thing or produce the whole thing within the main body in order to have a discussion. So for example, if you're talking about the Gantt chart in the main body and you're referring to how aspects of the Gantt chart were done, you might want to, within the main body, produce a figure which is just a sort of a snapshot of the Gantt chart, a piece that's relevant that you're talking about at the time, not the whole thing. But in Appendix 1 or Appendix 2, you could put the rather larger version of the Gantt chart, the more complete form, for the reader to have a look at if they wish to. So that's the end of my short little presentation on how to structure your project management assignments. Remember, the assignments are structured in such a way as that when you complete them, they teach you how to diagnose problems in projects. And when the reader reads the assignment, or what will finally be a report one day, hopefully for you, what the reader gets is that you've, in an objective way, dug into the details of how a particular aspect of the project was managed. You've also pointed out what should have been done. You've done that critical analysis. You've highlighted what the issues are, and you've come up with some recommendations to fix it next time.